So, tap the cord. Thank you. And this is for you, right? Yeah. Are we ready to begin? Looking for confirmation from NASA space station over there. Okay, thumbs up. Welcome everyone to this week's or this month's Little Bangkok Sangha Dhamma Talk. May I ask are any of you new to Little Bang? A few hands. Are any of you new to Buddhism? Thank you. Very good. That's helpful. So the two of you will probably be the first to be enlightened. You have beginner's mind. You don't have the preconceptions. Anyway, just very nice to see you all. We have the formidable four over there who are going to grill me with questions on philosophy later, I'm sure. So yeah, really I'm happy to be here, and I think we're being broadcast through the metaverse this evening, which I wouldn't always agree to. And one of the reasons I did was I have friends who are in other continents, and maybe some of them are tuning in this evening. But I want to I'll be addressing you, the physical entities in this room. It's more personable, and sort of ignore that uh, uh, movie camera over there. So you probably all saw the flyer. The title of this evening's talk is Meditating with Trauma. And last time I was here, I believe it was in early July. It was a talk given by Ajahn Nyaniko, who's the abbot of Abhayagiri Monastery. By the way, can you all hear me in the back? Okay? A little bit louder? Okay. And I had chosen this. I give talks here maybe every 3 months or so, and I had chosen this topic already, but it was quite coincidental that Ajahn Nyaniko, sometime during his talk, mentioned trauma. And I thought it was remarkable because it's not a topic that people talk about a lot, and it seemed serendipitous somehow because he said a few things that were really part of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And I can't remember the context where he was talking about trauma, but he mentioned that this is not a fixed position or a quote from the Pali Canon, but his impression was we all suffer from trauma to some extent. And I found that really powerful because it's a theme that I've been exploring, and it's not coincidental that I chose this topic. I'm not going to get very much involved in me and my story, but I have had to work with trauma in my life, and one of the trauma, you could say, is sort of on an extreme of mental disorder, is where things really break down. But it's not a black and white line. You could say it all starts with the little neuroses we have. And I remember reading, and I might be mistaken, that Carl Jung called a neurosis simply a means to try and avoid reality. And I like that because the truth, however, like I would imagine in some sense we're all truth seekers. But having said that, probably everyone to some extent is also a truth evader, because we might, it sounds nice, yeah, I want to wake up, I want to penetrate, I want to see the truth, I want to be enlightened. But you might know from personal experience that when we approach the truth, it can be frightening. And that fear is not necessarily a bad thing. And that to really, again, don't take everything I say as somehow the Buddha taught or the Buddha said. A lot I am going to be extrapolating and thinking out loud to some extent. But my feeling is if we really want to be enlightened or awakened, that the circuitry has to be pretty well established. And I mean that not just mentally, also physically, but primarily spiritually, mentally, that we need to be prepared. And I'll just give you a brief history of how I arrived to here tonight. I grew up in the States. I went to high school in America, and that's where I encountered Buddhism when I was 16. And it was a real life-changing event for me because I was quite confused at the time. And then I went to college in America, and my interest in Buddhism kept growing to the point where I finally, at age 24, I went to England. I'd met Ajahn Sumedho, who is the chief disciple of a very famous Thai meditation master named Ajahn Chah from the northeast, and he had monasteries in England. So I went there, and I felt so much at home. After just 3 days, I decided, okay, this is when I was 24. I decided, okay, this is my path for life. And as it turned out, it didn't work out for life, but I did spend 20 years in the monastery, 2 years as a novice and 18 years as a bhikkhu. And then I disrobed in 2007 and came back to Thailand to work. And so this idea of preparation, of laying a good foundation is, I think, essential. And that, again, if we're feeling a bit uneasy, if we're feeling that in our exploration it's taking us to an edge, sometimes I think it's important to go through the fear, but we have to know what is the right balance to negotiate that point. So, going back to Ajahn Yaniko's talk and the theme of tonight's talk of trauma, as I said, I have. It's been an important theme in my life, and working with it, as I was saying earlier, whether it's a neurosis, whether we're talking about what in Pali is called the kilesas, the mental defilements, whether it is sort of a greed, basically greed, hatred, and delusion, which we all have to some extent. We're not born unless we have some degree of greed, hatred, and delusion. The Siddhartha Gautama had greed, hatred, and delusion, still had residual, however many lifetimes he perfected the paramitas, the spiritual perfections. He also was confused and led him on his journey, why he left the palace, why he left his family, and went out into the jungle and to meditate, to explore, to look and see, is there a way out of, he had seen, you might have heard the story of the divine messengers of, say, a sick person, an old person, a corpse, and then a samana, someone who was a spiritual seeker, and that reawakened something in his mind where he felt, okay, I need to go and explore. I want to see, is there, just say the example of death, it's frightening. It's frightening. I don't know if many people would say they're completely fearless in the face of death. I hear a lot of people say, I'm not afraid of death, I'm afraid of dying. Or I'm not afraid of death, but I'm afraid of the pain right before I die. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, just the very fact that there's an uncertainty there, most of us, 99.9% of us do not know what's going to happen next. And that is unsettling. And so, although my talk's on trauma, we can also draw parallels to just other challenging mental states we have. And I think that's important, that it's not like there are these well-adjusted people in the world, and then there's these really messed up, screwed up people like me who, that it's one or the other, and then I feel like I'm a failure because why can't I be well-adjusted like a lot of people that I know? But then I also know that we're exceptionally good at masking our deficiencies. And part of that, I think, goes back to just the very origins of human society, of being very much a tribal, a social people. So it's okay to be weak to a certain extent, but if we show too much weakness, in the olden days, like if you were a king, there's a really wonderful book, I think it's called The Golden Bough. It's a huge book. It's like a thesis on anthropology, but he goes on about like a lot of the pagan cultures and of even, say, the rituals having to do with harvesting. But basically, when the king begins to become decrepit or even show any sign of weakness, you kill him. Because the king represents the health of that particular society. Now that's dramatic, and we don't do that anymore, as far as I know. But so this idea that there are well-adjusted people and then there are highly neurotic, messed up people, I think that that's not a very helpful generalization. I think it's true that there are a lot of people who can function well and go on with their lives, and I know many people like that. And I wish them well. But you never know what's sort of going on. I found that it takes a long time to get to know other people and even to get to know ourselves. And I think this is really also very interesting about trauma, is that I would set trauma aside, that it is like a rewiring. Something happens that is so difficult, so painful, that the hardwiring, so we're talking about, say, the reptilian brain and the mammalian brain. Let's not talk about the frontal lobes and the rational brain. We're talking about really basic, like fight or flight, how stress hormones are excreted. We're probably everyone here today is familiar with the term PTSD, but that wasn't recognized until, sort of officially, until the 1970s, I believe. And before that, in like the First World War, there was this term called, shell shock. And there was even a movement to stop using the term because it made the soldiers seem weak. And if you advertised this idea that these young men were coming back from the battlefield so scarred, so emotionally, basically in pieces, that didn't really speak well for the society at the time, who were sending these men to the front. And so yeah, it was very interesting to hear Ajahn Yaniko talk about trauma, and I do feel that, again, even if we haven't experienced a highly traumatic event in this lifetime, from a Buddhist perspective, you might know the story that the tears that we have shed over the countless lifetimes of losing loved ones, of basically undergoing various forms of deep sorrow, including trauma, would fill up all the oceans of this planet. That it's so we've and like I like watching movies about like Braveheart, or there's a lot of sort of people getting stabbed and javelins going through that. And this is the reality. If you do, and I'm not saying you should believe in rebirth, but if you do, the likelihood that we have died horrific deaths in the past is such that it's true. Most of us don't remember anything from one life to the next, but you could say that we carry with us an emotional tone, and that is just that's a reflection, a contemplation that I would say supports Ajahn Yaniko's comment that in a sense we're all traumatized. We all are working through, if nothing else, just the difficulty of being in these bodies, these sensitive bodies. We get burned, we get whatever. We have broken bones. We have, as I like to say, the world is full of these sharp edges. We're lucky if we're fortunate if we don't actually get stuck up on these. And part of life is just navigating, like driving safely, behaving well so that we don't make enemies. These are all what I would categorize as part of the sharp edges. Now, one of the reasons I often choose themes based on, I'm a translator of Buddhist texts, so it's often what I'm just happen to be translating. But on this occasion, and as sometimes happens, it's as a result of books that I'm reading. And a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago, Cindy, who you probably know, Cindy Stewart, she gave me this book called The Body Keeps the Score, and by Bessel van der Kolk. He's Dutch, but he is based in the US. And I found it a phenomenal read. Just really, if any of you are interested in trauma or in just mental health, I can't over recommend this book. There's maybe 2 pages where I felt it was a little superfluous, but everything else, it was spot on. He didn't really miss a beat, and it's really fascinating on so many levels. You learn a lot about neuroscience. You learn a lot about politics, because when it comes to, say, mental health and the treatment of damaged individuals, it's highly political. There's billions of dollars at stake, like in the US, in terms of how to treat people, and that's based often on diagnoses. And he has some scathing things to say about the US and their incapacity or their lack of empathy. Really, it just seems like common sense. He said the money you would save by just acknowledging that a traumatized child, let alone adult, will develop serious behavioral problems as an adult, and will cause so many problems in society, whether it's crime, alcoholism, whether it's abuse, self-abuse, or abuse of others, domestic abuse, on and on and on and on. And then also the amount of prescription drugs given, antipsychotics given, is, you would save billions if you could only acknowledge that this is part of reality. But there's a whole system in place that's resistant to that. Now, I'm not going to go into politics. I avoid religion. No, just politics, not religion. But again, a fascinating book, and I highly recommend it. And it inspired me to give this talk tonight. So you might wonder, well, what does Buddhism have to say about psychology? And I am a scholar, so bear with me. Tonight's talk, I'm going to divide sort of 50-50 between meditation and trauma, because they're both part of tonight's title, and it's one of my favorite themes is to question, like, this idea of meditation. There's this fascination with meditation, like this, almost like a panacea. People are looking for, we're all looking for a way out. We're looking for relief. And very often it turns to, well, if only I would meditate more. If only I would meditate better. And I think it's really important to question these assumptions we have about meditation, about where we're at, where we want to be, because let me politely dismiss the idea that Buddhism says not to have any desire. That's rubbish. Buddhism distinguishes between healthy and unhealthy desire. So unhealthy desire is called tanha, or craving, or it's also you could consider it as thirst. So in craving, this has a very, even in English, has a negative nuance to it. And the other word in Pali that's not well known is chanda, which is wholesome desire. So the desire to be enlightened, to be awake, is not bad. It's probably all of you here came because of some form of you desire to know more. If possible, you might appreciate some extra tools in your toolbox to get through life well, to live a good life, so that at our dying breath, you know, this is the Death Cafe. It's a bit creepy, by the way, but it happens to be here. Some of these mannequins are a bit creepy too, but don't let them distract you. We're all going to die, and can we, at our last breath, just say, all right, I lived a good life. I really did my best, even if we're not yet enlightened, at least have that sense of long exhalation and relax and say, okay, whatever comes next comes next. So this is, as I said, a favorite theme of mine. I do want to say a few things about meditation because it will tie in at the end with, once I speak with trauma, is how can we work with trauma? What are the ways that we can actually meditate with trauma? So in Pali, there are probably numerous words for what we would call meditation. There are four that I want to highlight tonight. The first one is patipati. The second one is bhavana. The third is kamatana. And the fourth is anupassana. Now, bear with me if you've never. If you know what Pali is, it's what we call the ancient Indian language that either specifically or very closely related was the vernacular at the time of the Buddha in central India during his lifetime. It was very closely related to Sanskrit, which is much more more known in the West. But they're very, very similar. So you have words like in the English language, a lot of Sanskrit words have entered the vocabulary, but the Pali, and then it can be a bit confusing. So like the word dharma is karma, nirvana. These are Sanskrit words. So the Pali equivalent would be kama or dhamma, kama, nibbana. So they're very similar, and this is just you can put a little post-it note for looking at that later. But as I said, my career path is now to translate Buddhist texts, and part of the challenge is to find English words that somehow match the Pali. How can we make, like some of the words have become, you could say, the standard, like mindfulness become now a very, pretty much an everyday word. It was an everyday word probably in the 18th century, and then went into some sort of oblivion, and then has been sort of pulled back out of the closet because it fits sati quite well. In Pali, it's sati for mindfulness. And so in tonight's talk, I do want to introduce some of these terms, because some of you have been studying Buddhism for years, and I think you might benefit from just refreshing these terms or getting a new perspective on these terms. So the word patipati, and in Thai it's patibat, and it just means practice, and is usually used in the context of, well, it's sometimes used in the context of a triad of pariyati, patipati, pativeda. So you study, so you gain knowledge, you go to school, you listen, you gain information, and then you apply it. And that's patipati. So you apply, and that's why patipati is usually just translated as practice. And then you have the pativeda, which literally means penetration. So it's insight, it's knowledge, it's awakening. So learning, application, awakening. But in the Thai, say in the Thai monasteries, if you tell someone you want them to get down to practice patipat, it means, serious, cross your legs, close your eyes, meditate. Okay, so that's one word. The second word, bhavana, is, I always thought it had an agricultural connotation, but I looked it up yesterday or a few days ago in both the Sanskrit and Pali dictionaries. It doesn't seem to originally have any. The reason I thought that is because very often I have found teachers talk about bhavana as, it's often translated as cultivation. Now, crops are cultivated, and the image is often used is of planting a tree. So you need to give proper sunlight, water, fertilizer, good soil. You want to care for it. And so that's why I always thought, all right, it must have been used by farmers, but I don't think it was. But it doesn't mean that it's a wrong application of the word, because it does have this sense of bringing into being, cultivating, developing. And with this word, there's one distinction some of you will be familiar with is samatha bhavana and vipassana bhavana. So samatha is tranquility, or you could say concentration, calm, and vipassana is insight. So it has more to do with the wisdom faculty. The former is more to do with the samadhi, the concentrative faculty. The latter more to do with insight, with the wisdom faculty. And there's a lot of debate. There's been heated debate, I think, since the time of the Buddha, of these different camps. Oh, you should practice samadhi. No, you should practice insight. No, and there's a bit of wrangling. Even to this day, I find some of the work I'm translating now, the monk is going on about, we're not doing samatha. We're not doing samatha. We're doing vipassana. And I'm a translator. Unless he's saying something that I think is really off, I'll translate it. But it's curious to me that there's still this sort of almost divisiveness or factionalism amongst Buddhists of which camp are you in? Are you a samatha or are you vipassana? And as I see it, they're both essential. If you look at the Eightfold Path, the first three factors are wisdom factors. The next three are what are called sila, or have to do with our behavior, right speech, right action, right livelihood. And then you have the three factors, or is it four factors? You have the first two are wisdom, next three are sila, and then the final three are what are, even though samadhi, concentration, is one of those, the group as a whole so vayama, or effort, mindfulness, and concentration the heading is called samadhi. So samadhi is part of samadhi. It can be a bit confusing. But there you see that for awakening to occur, think about like a mandala of, say, 8 lotus blossoms that have to bloom all at once, and then boom, that transformation occurs. Well, that's what's required. You can't just skip one. I'm just going to do them all except right speech. I'm just going to swear all the time and lie, but I'll do all the others, and I'm guaranteed to be enlightened. And they all have to be in place, and they all sort of nourish one another. So for me, that distinction is not that important. Let's move on with bhavana. I realize I want to make sure we have some time this evening for questions and answers. So I will contain myself. Another way of looking at bhavana, there's a fourfold division of kaya bhavana, sila bhavana, citta bhavana, and panya bhavana. And kaya means body. And some people will think, oh, that means exercise, knowing when to go for a run, bicycling, doing some yoga. It's not referring to that. Although kaya does mean body, or in Thai, gai, that it has to do with the senses. our five senses, not the mind, but the five sense doors, the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and tactile sensation, the body, that this is how we make contact with the world. And then it all converges at the mind, and then the mind does all kinds of funny things with that information. Perceptions and sensations and, well, first just being conscious or lack of conscious, but that's the area of the mind, and that would fall under the Citta Bhavana. Citta means mind, or heart, if you like. So you have Kaya Bhavana, and that, how do we develop the sense bases? Well, one is just to hone them. Like if you're an athlete, you want to, there are certain senses that are required, whether it's sight, whether it's your hand-eye coordination. This is one aspect of training the sense doors. But more importantly, there's this Indriya Sangvara, which is restraint. So actually knowing when not to make sense contact, to avoid certain sense contact. Like I didn't walk into the Sky High Cafe earlier because I didn't want to look at bongs and various variants of cannabis. Not that it's not my drug of choice, but that there are, I think you can all appreciate, there are some places it's better not to be. There are things that are better not to be seen. It's not so much that they are bad, is that often it's just overwhelming to us. So being able to develop sense restraint is very important. It maintains mental health if we know how to, when and where and how to interact with the world. So that's Kaya Bhavana. The second one, Sila Bhavana, is everything to do with human interaction. How do we relate to others well? How do we do it responsibly? How do we do it so we create harmony and not create aggravation or conflict? So that's Sila Bhavana. The third, as I mentioned, Citta Bhavana, has to do with the mind. And so that would have more, like that would, where what this word meditation, by the way, I think it only occurred in the English language for the first time in maybe the 17th century, but it goes back to Indo-European roots, and the root is a Sanskrit root, Pali Sanskrit root, ma, with the dash on the top, which means to measure. So it has this idea of mentally measuring, being able to, so it has to do partly with thought. It includes thought, being able to know, distinguish between what is skillful and unskillful. But you can also say measuring your energy. So it has those, what I mentioned earlier, of effort, mindfulness, and concentration. Those are the samadhi factors of the path. That is also a part of meditation. I do feel that amongst Buddhists, Western Buddhists, meditation has honed in on this almost not just fascination, but sometimes obsession with, you just got to be one-pointed. If I can only get the jhana state, if I can only develop those mental absorptions, then I can leapfrog all my problems, all my neuroses, all my phobias, all my erratic behavior, and somehow land on my feet and be enlightened and happy ever after. And I do think that, again, I really encourage you to look at your assumptions about what does meditation mean for you. And so I feel that in the English language, the word meditation has very much been conjoined with this Citta Bhavana. But Citta Bhavana is the third. The fourth is Panya Bhavana. And wisdom is considered supreme. Samadhi is seen as a tool, as a very, very important foundation and basis for wisdom. What does samadhi do? Well, it creates wholesome states of mind, like love, compassion, generosity. It creates capability, strength of mind, composure, equipoise, that stability and strength of mind, and health, mental health, so joy, contentment. All of these will then help. In one of my previous talks, I talked about how it's a natural process. You don't even need an act of will. If you lay the right foundations, then the fruit, your practice will bear fruit. It's not, now I want an apple. You stand by the apple tree and you hit it every once in a while. I want apples. I want apples. Then an apple comes and, I did that. No. We can cultivate, we can nourish the tree, but the apple comes of its own accord. It's part of a natural process. And likewise, there are aspects to our spiritual development that happen without cetana, without an act of will, happen naturally. So those four, that's another grouping of bhavana, of cultivation, of kaya, sila, citta, and panya. That is sometimes summed up by what's called sikha, the three training of sila, samadhi, panya. So kaya and sila are joined, and you're left with sila, samadhi, panya, which then is another way of talking about those four forms of bhavana. Okay, we'll move on to the next word, Pali word, which is kammatthana. Kamma is karma, so action, volitional action, or work. It can mean work. In this sense, it's often translated. Thana is a foundation. So it's a place. It's where we. It's a word for meditation. It's where we can apply ourselves. Areas where we can focus on strengthening the mind and developing the mind, both citta bhavana and panya bhavana. And in the Visuddhimagga, which is perhaps the most famous commentarial text, post maybe, I don't know, what is it, maybe 500 years after the Buddha died that it was authored, in there it mentions 40 different kinds of kammatthana. So you have the 10 kasinas. If you're familiar with those, it's like, for example, you take a disc, a red disc. You can do it at home. Cut out a cardboard or metal and paint it, and then sit. And very samadhi-oriented practice. Just with your eyes open until when you close your eyes, the red disc or the white disc or the blue, what is it? It's primary colors. Blue, I think it's blue, yellow, red, and white. There's another 6 which have to do with elements and other phenomena. But that's an example of a kasina meditation. So there's 10 of those. There's the 10 asubha meditations. Jun is a big fan of. It's related to Marana Sati. The subha is, in the olden days, we can't really do this anymore. You could go to a charnel ground and you would look at corpses in 10 stages of decomposition and just sit there and think, this, I too will be like this. So that was a meditation. I wouldn't say that's particularly concentration focused because it's pretty intense. The senses, the smells, the sights, the imagery, the perceptions are all very strong. So I would say that has more to do with insight, with reflection. And so there's 10 of those. Then you have the 10 anusati, which is usually translated as recollection. And the most famous of these, and the most famous of all Buddhist meditations, is anapanasati, which is the meditation on breathing. And so again, a lot of people will think that's what meditation is. But it's only one of 40. So I offer this to you because, again, I have, in all my years of living in Buddhist communities and being amongst Buddhists, especially for those of us who grew up in a Western European culture that's so goal-oriented and so much Success is determined by how much resolve you have, how willful. Like I've been watching the Netflix Formula One, Drive to Survive, and those egos in there are these billionaires who think, I have always been successful. It's just a matter of getting it done, and very much of I am in control, this very big I in the picture. And so I do feel that more gentleness, more being flexible, looking laterally, sideways, and re-examining what our stance, our perspectives is helpful. So there are 40 of these kamatanas. And then finally, the fourth word I mentioned was anupassana. So passati or passana literally means sight. It's also where you have this word vipassana, insight. So anu just means along with, following along with. And this is the word that's used in the meditation known as the four foundations of mindfulness, or the satipatthana. So you have you have kaya, the body, you have vedana, sensation or feeling, you have citta, the mind. Here it means more, not so much the mind in its totality, but more to do with mental states. So you could even say emotional states. And then you have Dhamma, which here is not the Dhamma, the truth, or the teachings of the Buddha. Dhamma sometimes just means phenomena. Everything that exists is a Dhamma. But also it can mean a little more narrow, whatever the mind door comes into, basically thoughts. We use the word mano, which is the mind, contacts dhammas, which are mind objects. Most commonly or most prevalently, thoughts, thinking. That's often, like in Thai, they'll often just translate it asความคิด, thought. And the word thinking has sort of, from what I gather, has taken on a sort of has developed a bad reputation amongst Buddhists, like stop thinking, meditate, don't think, empty your mind, as if that were an easy thing to do. And a lot of people tie themselves in knots because, okay, follow your breathing, and then they're off in the Bahamas, and then 5 minutes later, they're back breathing, but they're berating themselves because, why? Because I'm not following the assignment properly. I'm a failure. I can't meditate. Some people might even give up. But thinking is just it's a very essential human activity, function that we have. If we give up thinking and just follow, say, instinct, then we'll probably behave like salamanders, or I mean, they're actually probably pretty well behaved. So this is I've left this for anupassana or satipatthana as the last, because this is when I come back after I talk a little bit about the details or the intricacies of the mind in relation to trauma. It's anupassana, and especially citta anupassana, that I'd like to highlight as a way to work with trauma in meditation. Okay, now I wish I had a neurologist sitting next to me. I don't think this venerable here can help, but because this is where I'm going to look a little bit like the White House press secretary, and I'll have to use some notes, because it's part of the excitement of this book is the scientific aspect to it, the extraordinary detail of, and the discoveries that have been made about the human mind. One of the subtitle of this book, so the book is called The Body Keeps the Score. So the idea is that, as I said very early in this talk, that if we encounter a highly traumatic event, either as a child or as an adult, the likelihood of the wiring, the hard wiring getting messed up. And this is at the very core of the nervous system, that weird things start happening. And often people can go through years, decades, probably a lot of people go through their entire life without ever being able to undo that and find well-being or safety ever again in this life. And that's tragic in a sense, and it's exciting, super exciting to find people like Bessel van der Kolk, who's really so heartfelt, determined, and dedicated to his work. He really cares. You can feel how much he cares about his patients, so to speak, and the people he meets. And it's part of the beauty of the book. So the subtitle is Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. And I found that really skillful because, again, one of the themes I've talked about in the past is in Western culture, last talk I gave was on Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, and how Western European culture is so much grounded and rooted in Greek philosophy, much, much more than, there's very little influence by, say, Indian philosophy or Arabic philosophy, let alone, say, Peruvian, Aztec, Mesopotamian. Of course, the world, we've had this richness of people just trying to make sense of things. But and I grew up with this very much. And you look if you go to art museums, if you look at musical compositions, like classical music, the references, of course some of them are biblical, but so much is rooted, especially like in academia, in Greek philosophy. And so part of the struggle that we've had I say we, being, I mean, I'm sort of a, what's the more polite word for half-breed? I'm sort of half-Thai now. I don't look it, but I've lived in Thailand for more than 20 years, and it's changed me. But I am a Western conditioned person, and that's still very much, I'm very in touch with how that formed me. And one of the difficulties that in Western philosophy, and I think it's still not, we haven't come to any really kind of consensus around this, is this mind-body dilemma and consciousness. What the heck is that? Does it even exist? I mean, it's baffling. Here we are at, what is the year, 2023, right? That we still can't really even agree that consciousness exists. You know, there'll be people who just say, nah, it's just a emanation of matter. Take that. Okay, well, I take it, but it doesn't make any sense to me, and I don't find it's a very good premise to begin, say, a spiritual practice. I really find that, like in Buddhism, as I mentioned in my last talk, it's okay, boom, there's nama rupa. Okay, let's move on. We don't have to waste time debating whether there's nama rupa, mind and body. There are the 5 khandhas. You have the body, and then you have the 4 aggregates, the mental aggregates. And mind and body are interrelated. They're interdependent. They're not They're neither completely separate nor are they completely unified. Enough said. Enough said. Why, we don't need to waste our... I mean, it's... Okay, as an intellectual academic, or even you could say at some point in spiritual practice, to reflect on these is useful. But I think it's very noteworthy that the Buddha didn't... There's no meditation, really, of the 5 khandhas as such. Why is it the Satipatthana? Why is it not the 5 foundations of mindfulness using the 5 aggregates? Why? Because the 4 mental ones of consciousness, vedana, sensation, sanya, perception, sankhara, volitional formations, it's almost like trying to take apart a subatomic particle. They're so intertwined. And so elusive in a sense that, like, if you want to study subatomic physics and you don't have a good microscope, not much you can do. I think when did we even agree that there are neutrons and protons and electrons? Probably not more than, what, 100 years? You tell me. Formidable 4. Subatomic particles. When were they discovered? Tom? Okay, maybe 120 years. So pretty recent, pretty recent. So what did the Buddha encourage us to look at with the Satipatthanas? The body. Very easy. You can't ignore it. You can't ignore it. And that's why they say anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. Stop breathing, finished. And just whatever, this is the food we eat, the exercise, the aches and pains, body. Very, very basic. This is a starting point. Next one, vedana, whether it's pleasurable, painful, or neutral. A little more difficult, but manageable. Like right now, the temperature in this room. Do you find it, are you cold? Are you hot? Or are you just right? Pretty easy to determine. That's vedana. Citta, as I was saying, this word citta is a bit of can be a little bit, what's the word? Gnarly. Because it has many different contexts and, but in this context, I usually translate it as mind states or states of mind or even emotional states. So emotions, these are just energy patterns. They're like, look at the sky, especially in Thailand during the monsoon. It's constantly changing. Clouds, gray, sunlight. These are just energy patterns. They pass through, but they have more shape than, say, thoughts. Thoughts are a bit like lightning. And there are these sparks flying. Much harder to stay abreast of thoughts. Emotions, easier. I'm not saying easy, because emotions are intense. And if it's an unpleasant or painful emotion, then the tendency to try and escape is great. I think we all know that. And that has a big bearing on trauma too, is that when things get rewired improperly, then there's a desperation. And a lot of these, say, soldiers who come back with PTSD, they're good people. They're not evil people. I mean, they didn't necessarily go to war because they wanted to kill. They're often doing it out of patriotism or whatever. But they witnessed the most these atrocities, friends being killed, whatever, and they come back and they're trying to just live ordinary lives, and they're finding that is much, much more difficult than being out in the jungle of Vietnam or the deserts of Iraq, because when you're in that intensity, then there's probably so much adrenaline or whatnot going that it's like it's somehow, whatever, you manage to make sense of that. But when things start slowing down, and when you're sitting with your family and watching the 4th of July, sorry, I'm being very American here, fireworks displays, and then you go into a panic because you feel that you're being ambushed. And so then you go and you just down a bottle of whiskey, or you have these nightmares, or you have you simply these rage attacks. It's terrifying. It's terrible. And these are emotional patterns. Now again, trauma is at the extreme of a spectrum. We're not talking about being a psychopath or something like. I mean, that's a different extreme. But here we're talking about mental illness as something that's actually fairly common, probably much more common than most people are aware. In that trauma, how much it affects people, or how many people it affects. So this will be the area that I'll be highlighting. I'm just going to say a few. The time I've been talking for an hour, and I want to leave a good at least 20-30 minutes for questions. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the points that the author discusses in terms of neuroscience, because I think it's really both interesting and insightful, and very much related to Buddhist practice. That it's not like, for example, he says mindfulness is one of, he uses this word, and obviously, like in America, there's this mindfulness-based, what is it? Mindfulness-based, stress relief. Yeah. So it's been sort of extracted from its Buddhist context often, and no mention of Buddhism or the Buddha, but seen as a very effective tool, and from what I hear, much more effective, significantly more effective than, say, antidepressants or various kinds of pharmaceuticals that are used to treat people. So here he talks about the three brains. It's called what's called the triune, which is another way of saying Trinity. So we have the what's called the brain stem, which is also called the reptilian brain, and that has to do with basically what an infant already is very much relying on. Being able to know whether they're hungry or full, know whether they're temperature regulation, whether they wake, sleep and waking states, breathing, chemical balances. And so sometimes this part of the brain is referred to as instinctual. The second brain, so in a sense we all have three brains. Surprise, surprise. So the second brain is the limbic brain, or the limbic system, the mammalian brain. So this has very much to do with our emotional relevance and the way it's the central command post for coping with the challenges of living within our complex social networks. But it's still pretty rudimentary. It doesn't rely a lot on reasoning, on analysis. It's still very much based on, is it safe or is it dangerous? And so the author combines these two brains as what he calls the emotional brain, because in an important way, they work together. And when dealing with trauma, it's this area, especially the limbic system, where real change takes place. And the third is called the prefrontal cortex. And this, I didn't know any of this. The prefrontal cortex is part of the frontal lobes. The prefrontal cortex makes up about a third of the neocortex. And the neocortex is part of the cerebral cortex. So I'm really glad I'm not in medical school, because I just fail all these tests, I think. But I quickly want to go back to the emotional brain, the heart of the central nervous system. Its key task is to look out for your welfare, say by releasing a squirt of hormones. It jumps to conclusions based on rough similarities. And he quotes a really interesting example that Ajahn Chah used. You're walking along a path, you see a rope, you jump because you think it's a snake. That is the limbic system at work. It doesn't have time. It's an immediate. It sees this shape. It interprets it as a snake. You scream, you jump, you whatever. Or if you're very mindful, you just walk. But you get the gist. It reacts, whereas the prefrontal cortex is more, has to do with reasoning and thinking. So how he talks about many different methods for dealing with trauma. Now there's top down and bottom up. Top down is where you do use parts of the prefrontal cortex, but there are some areas, especially those that have to do with talking about and using language, that cannot directly access the limbic system. And so what's required is what's called the medial prefrontal cortex. And that has more to do with self-awareness and mindfulness, what he calls interoception. So it's not so much rational. It has more to do with what I would say is in Buddhism, what the role of mindfulness. That is one way of accessing and even helping the limbic system, or rewiring, bringing about balance. The other way, from the bottom up, is more very much body-based, whether it's through art or dance or music, yoga, and then he mentions there's a whole bunch of really fascinating treatments, which I won't go into, and unfortunately I looked up, there are all these websites. There's very few in Thailand, because I'd be very interested in exploring. There's one woman in Chiang Mai who does one, but otherwise, Thailand, obviously, they don't, there are other ways of dealing with mental illness that traditionally, like they do now have psychotherapists, but traditionally there are other ways of talking through or working through problems, pain, trauma. So finally, and I will now stop because I want to give some time for questions. I just want to go back to my own experience of how have I worked with not just trauma, but really difficult situations. As I said, sometimes even just emotional patterns or certain situations, moods, can be really intense. Like if I were to say, okay, for the next 5 minutes, let's watch our breath. Most of you are not going to panic. Watch your breath. It's pretty safe. But if you've just had a fight with someone that you love, and you come into this room and you're just feeling just like confused, hurt, there's an endless amounts of painful emotional states we can be in. And some of them are so intense that if we just try and be mindful of it, it's like trying to catch a wild horse or something. There's no grip. The way I often describe it is that we have a container, and part of spiritual practice is where we broaden our container. One way of say even accepting that we have maybe made some progress is where the same situation that really would have knocked us over 10 years ago, all right, that person just insulted me, and I'm not reacting. I'm not trying answering back rudely, getting all in a huff. I just realize that this is painful, but I can contain it. But there's still some situations that are super difficult. And a lot of times, say, why do people turn to drugs and alcohol? It's just to get away, just because it's an escape, a temporary escape. Often we know it's not good to do, but we do it anyway, just to try and get away from that. But going back to this Cittanupassana, how do we look at the heart? How do we look at it? How do we hold it in our, in our gentle attention? If it's something safe that is within our container, we can say, okay, just be with it. Watch it arise, watch it pass. Arise, sustain, pass. And then we develop insight. But if it is outside of the container, if the intensity is so great, then we're faced with a dilemma, because we can either seek an escape. I can't cope with this, give me my bottle of wine now. and then just sort of drown our sorrows, whatever. Or we can go into some sort of other sort of cotton wool state of sleep, basically, of not being, trying to be unconscious. Or we can find ways of still being present but out of control. And that's really hard. And that is what that's what I'm developing, you could say. That's something I'm working with. Where the citta, because the citta it's not the physical heart where I'm talking about. And it's not, when you talk about the mind in Buddhism, it's not the brain. It's a very, very Western, heady, sort of cerebral way of looking at. The citta doesn't have a particular location in our body. You could say it encompasses, it's everywhere in our body. And I would even say it's out of body. Some of the time, what I experience is out of the body awareness. It's so painful physically sometimes that I have to sort of leave my body, and this is not through obviously if I could attain jhana, which a lot of, if you look at stories of famous monks, even in the Pali Canon, of dealing with, say, being tortured or killed or whatever, they will go into jhana just to the mind then it distances itself from the pain. It abides in just one-pointedness, and it no longer, the sensations no longer impinge. But that's just a temporary abiding. For those of us who can't do that, then again, this is nothing to doctrinal or even Buddhist necessarily. This is something I've come up with myself, is how to work with these times when my container's not big enough, and where I really literally feel like I'm looking from the outside in, but there's still a presence of mind. The Cittanupassana is still active. I am aware of the chaos. I am aware of it not being okay, and that is a start. There is a sense of that's the best I can do in these circumstances. And so whether I am practicing true Cittanupassana or not, you'll have to ask this venerable gentleman next to me. But this is based on several decades of practice, and it's helpful for me. And so I offer this to you as a suggestion, as a reflection. Obviously, not as medical advice. It's a little subtitle going down at the bottom saying, follow this advice at your own risk. So I think that's enough for tonight's talk. And so I would like to hear if any of you have comments, questions on this theme or any other. Please, Molly will, yeah.
If they ask question, can you please repeat it briefly so people can hear on internet as well?
Sure.
And Robin, one thing that has been on my mind for years, and I think is related to the subject of trauma, is how little we talk about real traumatic events in our lives. And I've been coming to this group for about 14 years, and I think I'm the only one I've heard actually talk about, family problems or divorce. I don't know if that's because we're in Asia, and in Asian culture, it's kind of like what we say in America, you don't show other people your dirty laundry. But in America, they have all these programs, Dharma and meditation for chronic depression, Dharma and meditation for drug and alcohol addiction, Dharma and meditation for grief. And here we don't talk about those things specifically. And there are, this is widespread in our culture, people who are recovering from terrible abuse from their parents, or people who have girlfriends or boyfriends or husbands or wives who run out on them with another lover and leave them alone with 2 kids to raise. And we never talk about things like that. And that's, to me, disturbing that we just talk about it in theoretical terms, and how, I don't think it really addresses these problems if you just say follow the Eightfold Path and try to let go of your attachments and your clinging. How do we address these real life problems?
Well, there are probably a few things to say in response to that. First of all, that, like in your case, if you have, or anyone else, then you're here, you're in Thailand. Get certified and start your own, help others. That's how it starts, is someone like you, like any of us who just has the concern and wants to use whatever wisdom we've accrued to help others. So that's one thing. It's not a matter of there's any deliberate trying to ignore, I think, the realities, because one of the, when it comes to dukkha, to suffering, yeah, it's universal. It's always been there in human society. It will always be there. It's never going to be a celestial abode. This is a realm of existence that has a measure of very pleasurable and very painful experiences. And some people will go through life with predominantly one more or the other. Most of us, probably in this room, have a good mixture of the two, enough that we have time to be here. We're not so traumatized that we are paralyzed by it, and we're looking for answers. So that's one thing to say. The second is that one of the comments that Bessel van der Kolk talks about is that we are tribal. We are very much a social animal, and that by just, we don't have to necessarily go into the details of our problems, but just being there for one another and having some sort of participating, you could say this is a sangha. What does sangha mean? It means a community. You could say family if you like, but so that he says that's one of the most powerful ways of working through trauma, is to be with, have some meaning in your life that's connected to other people in your life. And I noticed that, like, as a boy, I suffered from depression for quite a long time. And it was only when I went to the monastery that just lifted. And why was that? It was really extraordinary that I found a community that really, I felt so embraced by it and understood, and we shared a similar aim. And so I wasn't saying, by no means was life easy, but that particular mental, whatever, dynamic went away. And so there's that. And yeah, so the particularities, the details, again, I think it's not so, there's no, another thing that Ajahn Yaniko mentioned, I think you were here for the talk, when he said that psychology and Buddhism, there's not going to be some perfect match. There'll be an overlap of sorts. And so Buddhism has a particular purpose. It has a focus. And so it doesn't discuss necessarily the perfect diet or the perfect exercise regime or how to deal with climate change. Obviously these are parts of reality. And one part of my notes that I didn't discuss was there's a discussion of different laws of nature. So you have the Utu Niyama of climate, you have Bija Niyama, genetics, you have Jitta Niyama, which in this case would be psychology. So it's recognized as a field. But the emphasis is more on, say, Dhamma Niyama of cause and effect, of Kamma Niyama, of the law of karma. So there are other areas that are highlighted in Buddhism. So this group, it's understandable, at least to me, that it'll focus on more traditional Buddhist themes. And it's not out of a lack of care, or at least that's not my impression. But I think that when you're ready to share your knowledge and understanding with others, then that will also bring joy to you, because by giving, it's an act of generosity, and that's where it really all starts, is through giving. So I hope that's helpful, Joe. I didn't repeat the question. I hope that everyone on Facebook heard that. No, I'm not familiar with it.
And the basic idea is that in meditation is that oftentimes it makes the trauma worse. Like people getting lost in it, instead of meditating, they get into their trauma, they get lost, and so on. And so his idea is that basically you have to treat the trauma first.
Good point. Very good question. Should I repeat it, or are people hearing this through the mic?
I think you have to repeat it on that one.
This one here. Okay, so the question has to do with that. I don't remember the title or the author, but there's a book about how, for many people, their trauma gets worse by meditating and that the point is, at least of this book, is that in many cases it's better to deal with your trauma before you really get into the nitty-gritty of meditating intensely. And is that a good summary of what you said? So I think it's an excellent point. And I never met crazy people before I went to the monastery. I'm not joking. I am joking, but I'm also not joking. Like, I was very buffered, very sheltered. And it was a rude awakening for me, not a genuine awakening, but just I think partly is that, especially in monasteries, they attract borderline personalities, and I don't say that in a negative sense. It's like people are really to go to that sort of extent, especially like to be ordained as a monk or a nun, or even to go on long-term retreat. Yeah, you'll find a good number of well-adjusted people, but you get a lot of people who are just really teetering on the edge of sanity and insanity, and are just end up, it's almost like a welfare state. You get a bed, you get free food, and so it added to my trauma, just witnessing other people going psychotic. I literally saw or witnessed at least 3 or 4 people go psychotic in where I was living. And I'd heard of psychosis, but it was always just some sort of abstract. But actually witnessing someone hearing voices and really going around the bend is a very scary thing. And so one of my teachers, he's the abbot up in Northumberland, Ajahn Munindo, he is now so careful about vetting people, like the idea that everyone should be able to be a monk or a nun. All you just need is a sincere desire to come and practice. He says no. Because if someone starts to go off the edge, who's going to catch them? Well, it's the community, and it takes a huge toll on the community when people go crazy. And it's disruptive and frightening, and so he will now turn people down and say, I don't think you're emotionally stable enough to be a monk. Go and have therapy for a year or 2 and come back. And I think that's great advice. I think it's really good advice. Like, you really should be careful about who you admit into that sort of community. And so that, I think, accords with what you're saying, or the book that you were mentioning, that it's focusing, especially, this goes back to my whole first half of my theme of what is meditation. If it's just a matter of, if you can do sense restraint or sila bhavana, of just being a good person, speaking kindly, learning how to help the community, that shouldn't cause much problem. But once you ask them to sit on a cushion for an hour every morning, every evening for, and then maybe do a 3-month retreat where you're not talking to anyone, it's almost asking for trouble. So it can be explosive, and I think it really does require the maturity of the leader of the community to know. But it doesn't have to just be monastics. It can also be, generally speaking, individuals who want to meditate. We also should take stock and ask ourselves, are we prepared? Because the whole idea of Buddhist practice is to turn up the volume, the pressure. If it's like a pipe that holds water. If we just let the water sort of dissipate, it often just goes into the kind of the swamp, the bog, whatever. It's like there isn't maybe that much progress being made. And I'm not saying that in a judgmental way. But if you feel ready, then part of, say, renunciation is to do without. And by doing without, you are going to feel it. It's like putting a tiger in a cage. And it will pace back and forth, and it will growl. And if you get anywhere close to it, it'll bite your hand off. But if you let it roam in the forest, it's quite happy to just chase antelopes. But you put it in a cage, and that's what renunciation does. And so we also have to be honest with ourselves, whether, to what extent, what kind of meditation Like Ajahn Chah would often have the monks building roads. They hated it because they wanted to be sitting quietly, peacefully, getting enlightened, so happy. No, out in the sun, sweating, toiling, suffering. You know, I remember one story of this Western monk just sitting completely dejected, so depressed. And Ajahn Chah walked by and just said, "Just die." Obviously, he's not saying that literally. He's not saying commit suicide. He's just saying, like, let that S.T go. You know, just let it go. Just let it go. You know, if you just, you know, if you have to wallow in it for a while, wallow. But in the end, let it go. It's not worth hanging on to. But, you know, some people, when I was a novice, I was woken up at 2 a.m. My fellow postulant or novice, he was running away in the middle of the night. I didn't even know this expression, to do a bunk. He's like, he gave me his little Buddha Rupa, and he ran out the door at 2 a.m. We never saw him again. I didn't see him for like 15 years. Anyway, thank you so much for your question. I think I'm getting notices. We have to finish by 8 punctually. So I'm sorry that we haven't been able to answer more questions.
Last question?
Last question. Sure. You had a question?
Well, maybe I can ask you after.
If you,
First, we can have it's a longer question.
as you like. As you like. That's all.
This is the end of today, and without Bangkok Sangha, I would like to thank Robin for coming to be our speaker. Robin is our speaker like once every 3 months, so we will see you again in the next 3 months.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and we appreciate that. And if you want to show your gratitude to Robin, there's a gratitude box in front with the label speaker. And also we've been given this free space by Ban Aree Foundation. If you want to show some of your gratitude, there's a donation box for Ban Aree Foundation. Yeah. And next 3 weeks, we will have Prakandit for 3 Mondays. In there, Prakandit is the Buddhist monk, British Buddhist monk. And normally he will have of his session will be meditation. And last but not least, if you can help pick up the chairs and proceed and put it away. And thank you for today. See you next time.
Thank you, Roy. There you go. Take a photo. Yeah. Fabulous. Fabulous photo. Hey. I don't know. Maybe you have all your bank account details. Yeah. That is so contentious. It's so contentious that it's a very, very painful. I mean, it's very, very. It's part of what's happening, but it's very insightful. How he and he's. I love his style. You know, he he parades, but he doesn't bitch, you know, he doesn't rail. He just says, this is really irresponsible.
There has been a lot of thought that because it was seen as a panacea, like a quick fix,
Yeah, it was a revolution. It was a